I would imagine even the Americans would struggle to talk the Israelis out of this. The only thing the Americans can do is sort of to actually hard bargain by cutting military support to Israel. But we're, I think, quite a long way away from that. I think the Americans and the British, the best thing they can do is to argue for proportionality. I think if they argue for a ceasefire, I think the Israelis are going to ignore them. Yeah, these are important questions because it's more than just a case of semantics. These are fundamentally different things. So I think people are generally, saying, why can't there be a stop in the fighting? But to call for a ceasefire, this is actually quite a formalized agreement between warring parties where they will be signatories to an arrangement that has probably a series of de-escalatory steps around pulling weapons away from certain areas. What the UN has been discussing is a humanitarian truce, a pause in the fighting, which would mean that in this case, Israel ceases using its military force for a certain period of time. But of course, the biggest obstacle is that Israel has no intention of doing any of these things. It is building up to a war footing. It is in its own sort of mind preparing the ground for a ground incursion. And unless there is Israeli buy-in, you wouldn't get, let alone a ceasefire, you won't even get a humanitarian pause. So that, I think, is where the situation is at. There's just going to be a greater amount of Israeli military force being used. And I think even louder calls from outside observers for some kind of pause in that fighting.
And so then, in your view, Samir, can you grade the kind of feasibility of any of these options, whether it be a humanitarian pause, humanitarian truce, and all the way to a formal ceasefire? What is the likelihood of any of these?
So a formal ceasefire, I'd say there's absolutely no chance whatsoever. The only possibility would be after Israel has conducted its military operations and it decides that it wants to engage in some sort of ceasefire. But you need to have willing parties and mediation to get there. There is a possibility that there could be localized truces, and already arguably the Israelis they've argued, they've allowed for the passage of people from northern Gaza to southern Gaza. There could be localized ceasefires that relate to specific areas, but I would suspect that a truce would only be seen after Israel feels it has started to achieve some of its own military objectives, however it understands those.
Who is the leader here when it comes to working towards working for a ceasefire?
Do you know, I think given the scale of rage in Israel, I suspect even the Americans would slightly struggle to talk Netanyahu out of this. And I'm just going to give you one example from recent conflicts where I think, sadly, this is headed. And by the way, I agree with the other points being raised that, clearly the cure cannot be worse than the poison. You cannot kill your way to a sustainable peace. However, it's simple for us to make that moral case. In reality, the way this is likely to unfold, I now fear might look like Sri Lanka in 2009, when the Sri Lankan military mounted a no-holds-barred offensive to eradicate the Tamil Tiger terrorist and insurgent group. I fear that the counter-example that you may hear from these isolated instances, like in Sri Lanka, is, well, yes, many civilians died, but we eradicated the armed group. That, I fear, is a sort of benchmark that Netanyahu and his military planners are aiming at. The other final similarity is that the Tamil Tigers were eradicated because, of course, they are on an island of Sri Lanka. The Gaza Strip is, of course, a coastal enclave. So you can imagine some sort of push maybe all the way to the coast in the next few months. I would imagine even the Americans would struggle to talk the Israelis out of this. The only thing the Americans can do is sort of to actually hard bargain by cutting military support to Israel. But we're, I think, quite a long way away from that. I think the Americans and the British, the best thing they can do is to argue for proportionality. I think if they argue for a ceasefire, I think the Israelis are going to ignore them, sadly.